Good afternoon and welcome to the Financial Inclusion Forum event on digital ID. Thank you particularly to cricket fans for avoiding the test and coming to join us. India, I think, only needs 20 to win. I'm Paul Blythe, the chair of the Financial Inclusion Forum, and we have many old friends joining us today, but also folks attending for the first time. So I'll say a little bit about the Financial Inclusion Forum. We exist to raise awareness of financial inclusion and to share best practice. This encompasses everything from economic empowerment to microfinance and impact investment. We do this via holding Chatham House Rules breakfast events for industry practitioners and online and evening events for experts and the general public alike. We also share best practice via social media platforms, our website and our blog. We started life as the Microfinance Club over 15 years ago, and we've been focused primarily on developing world financial inclusion. But as a UK-based organization, we decided a couple of years ago to step out with an intent to have a UK financial inclusion, as part of our core strategy. So today is a big day for us, as it is our first UK-focused event for many a year. And we've been blessed by Sian Williams joining our board to lead our efforts in this area. And this is the first event she's led, and I'm really looking forward to it. So thank you to Sian for her leadership in this area. We are a 100% volunteer board, and all of our events are free. We are supported by a part-time professional secretariat and so couldn't be here without the support of our corporate and individual sponsors. So I'd like to formally thank City Inclusive Finance, CDC and EY as core sponsors, and also Vision Fund, and for this event, the University of Nottingham Social Impact Game and Learning Without Borders. If we could move to the next slide, please, Rod. So please support our work. If your organization has an interest in economic empowerment, financial inclusion, microfinance, impact investment and the like in the UK and or around the world, then please get in touch with us at admin@financialinclusionforum.uk or as an individual sponsor using the QR code, which is hopefully on your screen, or via our website at financialinclusionforum.org.uk/supporters. So without further ado, I will hand over to Sian. And thank you to Sian and to the panelists.
Hi, my name is Sian Williams and I am one of the board members of the Financial Inclusion Forum. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to listen to some fantastic speakers from around the world who have volunteered to give their time to share their insight and learning into a really important topic of financial inclusion and digital ID. So the kind of whole point of this conversation is to help us think through how can digital ID be used in an inclusive way? How can we make digital ID work for people? And how do we do that in a way that is preemptive and proactive rather than trying to kind of design it in later? Over the next hour and a half, we're going to hear from a range of speakers around the world. We're going to begin with Dr. Sarah Walton, who has been working on how can we identify who in the UK is digital poor, so who doesn't have a digital identity or the component parts of a digital identity. Sarah's going to launch new research that hasn't been shared yet, so that's really exciting. And then we'll have 5 minutes to ask Sarah some questions before she hot-foots it off to another event where she's going to present the research. We'll then hear from Shri. Shri is going to talk to us about how digital ID in India has been reaching over 1 billion people. The program there is impressive. It solves so many problems, and we want to hear from Shri about how do we really build a digital identity that works so well for people. We're then going to go to Estonia, and Florian is going to tell us about how Estonia's model has been working in a very different environment, helping people access services. Then we'll think about what does it look like in mobile. How does mobile work? And we'll think about a couple of options. So Canada has been doing really interesting work. So after Florian's talked to us about Estonia, we're going to hear from Radhika. Radhika is going to tell us the model in Canada and why an organised identity platform can really help with inclusion around digital ID. We'll then move to Yiannis. Yiannis is going to talk us through mobile. How does mobile work? And Yiannis is going to draw out a range of learning from around the world. And finally, we're going to come to Emrys. And Emrys has been working both internationally and in the UK. And Emrys is going to help us think through who does it work for? What do we need to learn from these different models and how can we move forward? So that's the kind of schema of the day. And so as we introduce each person, they'll have a slot, talk us through. We'll do questions on everything else except Sarah's research at the end, but you've got a Q&A option. So please keep firing the questions off. The speaker's going to be reading them, and then we'll be looking at them. We'll curate for the end of the session around a good conversation. So please get in there with your questions. And as we go through, we'll have some polls, in-flight polls, and if you can answer those as we go, that would be brilliant. So let me introduce first Sarah Walton, launching First Research, not being shared anywhere else. So we feel really honoured, Sarah, that you're joining us. I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, isn't it always the way that the tech fails just when you need it? I'm sure it has a good giggle, but thank you, Sean. It's really great to be here. I'm going to be sharing my screen right now, and if anyone can't see this first screen, which says the ID poor in the UK, can you shout so that Rod knows? And Rod, let me know if anyone's shouting, because I can't see my chat now that I'm sharing my screen. You're on mute, Rod. Is it a thumbs up? No one's complaining? Thumbs up, great, okay.
Yeah, we're good.
Great, cool. So hello everyone, thank you so much, and thank you to Toynbee Hall for inviting me here. And I so wish I could stay for the full event, but you're getting some insight that the commissioners of this piece of work haven't yet seen. They'll see it in just under an hour's time. So my name's Sarah, hello, and I've been doing and have been commissioned to look at a piece of work on behalf of the UK government through the Open Identity Exchange. So I'm looking at the problem that we have in the UK and defining the ID poor and how we can bridge the ID gap. So this piece of work's been done in collaboration with Experian. We've worked very closely with Experian on defining the ID poor using their data sets. It's been also closely led by the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, who own the digital ID agenda in the UK, and the Government Digital Service, who have stood up the gov.uk Verify solution for a number of years now. So we have a lot of learning from them, and a plethora of other organisations who have been driving this, government departments and also private sector, including Post Office, Tech UK, TISA, UK Finance, Women in Identity. So what's the UK's problem? Well, the UK has a big challenge. 30 to 40% of people fail to create a digital ID. And in many cases, this is because they have not got a driving license or a passport, which are the two forms of identification that primarily are used to get a digital identity. So the hypothesis was that if we add and introduce new data sets into the ecosystem and leverage alternative proofing techniques using alternative ID proofs, we will improve access to identity services. So the project's aiming to create a benchmark and segment the population of the UK, understand how we define the ID poor and who and where they are, and prioritise a list of alternative data sets and proofing techniques so that those people who are ID poor can get a digital identity and aren't excluded as they currently are. And just to note, this isn't just for ID issuers through government. This is also private sector. So we're taking into consideration the whole world of open banking and potentially other service providers. So how do we define the ID poor? Well, the challenge is the ID poor are across all segments of the population and in all socioeconomic demographics. So we worked with Experian. We looked at a number of different data sets and all agreed that the MOSAIC 7 data set was the richest in terms of the type of variables that we were looking at to define the ID poor. So first of all, we ranked the UK households with a higher propensity to have neither of these two ID proofs, the driving licence and the passport. Secondly, we identified key drivers to segment the ID poor universe by age, digital literacy and financial resilience. And thirdly, we identified key variables to quantify how many people in each group may have an alternative ID proof or be in an alternative data set. For example, be on Department of Work and Pensions benefits like housing benefit or other forms of job seekers allowance benefit, for example, or have a qualification, in which case they would be comprehensively in the Department of Education's learning record database, as long as they're 14 plus. So exclusions, we couldn't look for legal reasons and interrogate those people who are under the age of 18. And because a lot of the age group of 18 to 22-year-olds are in homes of multiple occupancy, either with parents or in shared accommodation, we looked at those groups separately. Because the MOSAIC 7 data is based on households. So we were estimating individuals in those households. So the key segment drivers that I mentioned, age, digitally excluded and financially excluded. I know to this group, the financially excluded definition will be of interest. We talked to the FCA and the University of Bristol about how they defined this group, and we made some tweaks of our own. But at a high level, those who are financially excluded, we looked at resilience and not resilient, and those who are not resilient, we defined as not being able to respond to financial change. So they've got no savings, can't access mainstream credit, and they have fuel and water poverty, can't pay household bills. What do we find? We've got 6 segments. The 6th one, the young home sharers, we segmented into 2 groups. The 13 to 18, they tended to live at home. 80 to 90% travel by air, sea and tunnel. So they're highly likely going to have a passport. And combined with the fact that they also use mobile phones for some quite sophisticated usage, they will probably have a functionality on their phone which would enable them to get a digital ID without the driving license and without some of they were not going to have a credit history, for example. The 19 to 22 age group, very transient, partly picked up in segment 4, but we can't see them because it's household data. And so we work with the Office of National Statistics data to manually interrogate this segment. So segments 1 to 5, were there any surprises? There were a few. Initially, when we started talking about this and when we had the first conversation with the steering group, we thought, well, they're going to be young and old, and they're going to be maybe mostly rural. And the surprises were that they weren't all young or old, although obviously a large proportion are young, 6.7 million of them, and a pretty high proportion are older too. But there's a great big chunk in the middle, and a great big chunk in the middle who not only are 26 to 45 years of age, but they're also in a place where some people hadn't expected them to be. They're in London, in the city that's supposedly the richest city in the country, and certainly some people hadn't expected there to be a lot of ID poor. Having grown up in the UK, probably falling for about 10 years into the segment 4 urban renters, it wasn't a huge surprise to me. you live in London, you don't want a car, it's a liability. And if you can't afford to travel, there's no point having a passport. So a lot of these groups have an overlap. They have neither passport or driving license. So let's have a look at a few of them. Segment 1, if we see here, this, I don't have a little red thing, but if you look at the ID poor circle where we've got the 15%, we can see here that about 15% of this group are ID poor, and that equates to just under 300,000 adults, and they are mostly retired, and those who are working tend to be in roles that are found close to home, and they tend to be below average wages. They have very little left at the end of the month, and the older portion of this group tend to be on very small pension incomes. A large proportion are on housing benefits, and a lot are very, very rural in this group, as with segment 2, very rural. So we can see here that most of them are in Scotland, in the Highlands of Scotland. For those who don't know the UK, this is a very rural area. And then other areas that are very rural in the UK, like the western tip of the UK, that orange, the orange splodges on the map, basically. These are very rural areas. And that wasn't a huge surprise. Where we got these, some of these surprises for some people was in segments 4 and 5. So we can see here in segment poor, we've identified these as the poor urban renters. About 18% of households in this segment are ID poor. The largest proportion, if we look at the bottom at the age bands, are 34% of this group are in the 26 to 35 age group. Now, they're also urban, and the largest proportion by a long shot are in London and other urban areas around the country, but most of them in London. Again, segment 5, we can see we've got a higher proportion in the 26 to 45 age group, although they are spread across the whole group, and a very large proportion again, well over 1 million people, not quite as many as in segment 4, but well over 1 million people in London. So how can we get to these people with alternative proofing techniques? Well, the passport and driving license, as you can see, highest evidence strength, lowest risk, but a lot of these people don't have them. So there's a whole list of alternative proofing, ID proofs and proofing techniques that we looked at, which included, for example, the Learning Record Service, which I mentioned. They could be in that data set, or they could have a benefits letter, housing benefits letter from their local authority or the Department of Work and Pensions. So we looked at 9 proofing techniques, and these went from being reasonably online to completely 100% offline, which is number 9 with vouching. And we looked at the data so that we could see which of these segments had a higher than average proportion, higher than average likelihood to have some of these alternative proofing techniques. So I'm going to finish up there. The next steps are to agree a prioritised list of data sets and alternative proofing techniques, and the report and brochure will be published at the end of March. So it's a very quick run through with some very rich stats. Thank you ever so much for listening, everyone. And if there's any questions, I'm very happy to answer them.
Thank you, Sarah. That was amazing. Can I just check you can hear me, because I've had to reboot a computer and I want to make sure. Excellent. Sarah, that was incredible. Thank you so much. So just to answer one question, which is on everyone's lips, Sarah, how much of these slides can we share and when? How and where else can they hear about your amazing research in more detail?
I will. It was one of the things I was going to get back to you on, Sian. As I said, I haven't shared these with the commissioners. I haven't shared these with the money men yet, those who are paying for it. So you're getting a sneak preview. I'm going to talk to OIX about what can be shared and what can't be shared. And I'll let you know. And I'll let you know by the end of play tomorrow.
Amazing, thank you. And you know, Sarah, you've been so generous with your kind of learning and insights already. And I know that many people will want to kind of follow up with you. We've got a question around what percentage of adults, so over 18s, are ID poor. Are we able to tell that from the research so far?
So yes and no. Sorry, I sound like a politician, don't I? So what these statistics are showing us is the propensity. So yes, in the sense that we can make an estimate, and no, in the sense that we can't come up with any accurate details. So overall, we've got about 2.5 million adults, but that's an estimate, and that's only in these segments. So these are the segments that have the big chunks of ID poor, but there are other segments around the UK that will also have some ID poor people in them, and there is overlap between the segments. So they're the caveats, but we can make an estimate, yes, and it's in the millions, yes.
Brilliant, thank you. So Caroline Beck is asking you, how did the sample selected pass the online banking ID checks?
So in terms of sample selected, do you mean the people that are highly likely to be in these segments?
Yeah, so if you've included these people in the segment, like if they haven't got the ID that so if they're in the sample that suggests that they haven't got ID, how do they get through that ID check around access to banking, for example?
Oh, in a bank, know your customer. Well, anyone from a bank here can say otherwise, but the KYC checks are notorious, and the bank wants to know you exist. But do they verify your identification? So double check that it's actually you. Or they validate your identity so they know the identity exists. Do they validate it's you? To some extent, but not 100%. And quite often it's done on a vouch. So that number 9 in my list, it's done manually. So what we're looking at is how we can get as many people through online digitally. So there are at the moment there's manual ways of doing it, yes, but we want to decrease those numbers.
And just thinking about the role that telecoms can play in identifying people who are I guess, ID poor or excluded. And we'll hear more from Yiannis later in the session on the role that mobile is playing elsewhere in the world. But from a UK perspective, what are you hoping for what is the research telling you that there's a role for mobile?
So one of the areas that was out of scope is accessibility. And one of the suggestions, although the report's not been written yet, will be there's more work to do here. Because I used to work with the team to find on verify gov.uk what we don't know about ID and how can we find that out. There are several projects that we ran with mobile operators, with the GSMA in the UK and various other mobile phone operators, which demonstrated to us that there's a lot we can do with mobile operators. And the case is what and how we can protect the customer, or the question is how we can protect the customer and their identity and their privacy in order, and at the same time balance that balance the risk to the customer and the ID issuer with the seamless and the benefits of being able to use that mobile data, which is rich And it also gives us a very good idea. For example, the location-based services, if someone's got those switched on, gives a very, very good idea that the likelihood of that mobile phone being in that person's hands, therefore a higher propensity to be able to verify and bind an individual to not just validate, but also verify. That's not part of this project, though. I'm speaking from research that I was overseeing about 4 or 5 years ago. So there's a caveat. But I would say, speaking outside of this project, mobile will be key.
Yeah, and of course, I know that it's not in the scope of the project, given what you've just said, but you know, the numbers of people who don't have access to mobile, who don't have access to internet in a format that kind of corresponds well to creating a digital footprint. Have you seen any evidence in the work you've done on this piece of research or before about the scale of that and whether that scale is reducing? People who are excluded because of a lack of mobile or internet access.
Yeah, well, actually, we have looked at access capability on this in this piece of work. And the key indicator that we chose at a high level was use of banking apps on mobiles, because there's a very high, I mean, I spent 20 years now working in different capacities looking at exclusion. This project's not looking at exclusion. It's looking at ID exclusion, not digital exclusion, which are slightly different things, although there's an overlap. If someone's got a smartphone and if someone has access via data, for example, that's all well and good, but a lot of people can't afford data. It's too expensive. So the Royal Holloway report that came out, led by GSMA most recently, in December or November 2020, looked at this issue recently. There's lots of work that's been done on it. Also, people's capability. So why banking apps? Because if they're doing banking online via their mobile phone, they're probably going to be able to set up their digital ID. And having sat in labs over the years next to people who are struggling to do stuff online, they may have got their grandchild to help them set up an email, for example. So it looks like, in terms of the stats, they've got access and they're doing stuff online, but they need to have a level of digital skills that is enabling them to do some more complex transactions online to be able to do this. It's getting easier and easier, but it's still prohibitive, yeah.
Amazing, Sarah, thank you so much. We're getting lots of questions coming in, but I know that you need to scoot because you've got to be somewhere else really soon. For everyone listening, apologies that we've not been able to ask all of your questions to Sarah, but we will be following up with Sarah and getting answers to those questions after the event. So please, all the way through, keep thinking about what you'd like to ask about the research and we can follow up. Sarah, thank you so much and good luck this afternoon with presenting the research elsewhere. And thank you for sharing. Really amazing work.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be here. Goodbye, everyone.
So we'll start to think now about, having explored the digital poor kind of challenge in one country, which happens to be the UK, how are other countries tackling that problem, solving that problem, and also what have they got in order to kind of share with us here in the UK or wherever you are, where you're listening, and what are the different models? So we're going to go now to Shrikant Karwa, and Shri works now at MOSIP, which is an incredible development that began in India, thinking about how do you solve the problem of digital ID in India and the Aadhaar system. And in Shri's current role, he thinks about how MOSIP can take that learning and share it with other countries. So Shri, it's a real pleasure to have you with us, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Rod. Rod, you'll control the presentation, so I'll get started. Hello, friends. I'm Shrikant Karwa, and today I will tell you about India's digital ID project called Aadhaar. and its impact in accelerating financial inclusion. I was part of this Aadhaar project during its early days, and now I lead the country relationships for an open source ID platform called MOSIP. Next slide, please. Aadhaar is the brand name of India's digital foundational ID system. It started in 2010, and so far it has issued 1.28 billion unique IDs. India does not have a robust birth registry system. So a large percentage of the population, anywhere you can take a number between 10 to 40, of people do not have birth certificates. And that is why it was decided that biometrics was to be used to establish uniqueness in this ID system. Minimal data is collected to enroll people in the ID, such as the photograph, biometrics like the iris and all the 10 fingerprints, name, date of birth, gender, and postal address. The system establishes uniqueness based on the biometric and the demographic data that's collected, and a unique number called the Aadhaar number is issued. This Aadhaar number is a 12-digit random non-intelligent number. Once issued, it belongs to a person for life and after. Since Aadhaar is a foundational ID system, it has not been created for a specific use case or an application. It's neutral to its application. So the issuing authority merely issues the number and verifies the identity. So in a sense, it's like a modern utility for identification and verification. Next slide, please. There are two services that Aadhaar provides in the ID verification space. First is authentication. This is a match, no match response with no data disclosure. It can be done for biometrics as well as for the demographic data that's collected. The eKYC data, which Sarah also spoke about. This is a service where after a successful authentication, demographic data and photo are transferred from the Aadhaar system to a service provider, example to a bank or a telecom service provider. The eKYC significantly reduces the cost of starting services like opening a bank account and leads to accelerated financial inclusion. Next slide, please. Aadhaar is a popular project in development circles because of the scale and speed with which it has created impact in poverty elevation. Some of the key numbers are, we used to issue 2 million unique IDs at the peak when the project was rolling out. I think we do about 5 million a month currently still. There are about 1.28 billion IDs issued with 98% coverage across the country. The application of this ID can be seen by the fact that 1 billion authentications are being done on a monthly basis and 100 million eKYCs are being used on a monthly basis. About 80 million Aadhaar-based, Aadhaar-linked bank account transactions are happening per month. And this whole infrastructure got created at a very minuscule cost of less than $1 per ID. So, this combination makes it a very interesting project to look at. Next slide, please. There are many applications to digital ID infrastructure to minimize friction in engaging with the government, private agencies. But today I'm just going to focus on the financial inclusion application. Next slide, please. In 2008, financial exclusion was rampant, with mere 17% of India's population having access to banking as per the Global Findex database. Next slide, please. By 2011, India's financial inclusion coverage matched the global trajectory as per the same database. The Aadhaar project started in 2010 and was issuing IDs to millions of people every day. Now, this extremely low-cost eKYC service, along with the Aadhaar issue, incentivized banks to open bank accounts even for the small account holder. And coverage of bank accounts opening across India, making the current country a strong outlier in the global trajectory projections. Next slide. So India went from a low less than 20% bank account coverage to 80% coverage in a decade. And this would have otherwise taken, almost half a century if it was business as usual. That is no digital ID infrastructure. So it's a kind of impact that a well thought out digital ID system can make to accelerate financial inclusion. Next slide, please. Now, India used the wide banking coverage, which got created, to bring in efficiency in its service delivery by kickstarting the direct benefits transfer services. So spectrum of DBT services range from scholarships, pensions, to subsidized food and fertilizer. There was significant ghost and duplicate beneficiaries in each government program, and this led to reduction in those areas. For the financial year ended March 2020, about 32 billion pounds worth of money was distributed and using about 2.5 billion transactions. And the government of India claims that till date, they have saved about 17.5 billion pounds due to direct benefits transfer. I'm not talking about the intangible and the indirect benefits and the conveniences that are there. This is pure government reported numbers. And when we look at $1 ID cost per ID, you look at the project has paid for itself multiple times in such a few years of rollout. Next slide, please. So now this is the new application that is coming out is in this pandemic. So the ID verification infrastructure, the Aadhaar linked bank account, the payment infrastructure, all together enables the government today to disperse large amounts of relief money directly into people's bank account as the pandemic lockdown disrupted the economic lives of millions of people. Now, as COVID vaccination process has started, again, the digital ID infrastructure will now come in handy to streamline the logistics. Next slide. Sustained financial inclusion requires strong infrastructure creation to minimize friction on the various legs of the transaction. Identity is one of them, payments is another one, data transfer is another one. In India, this trinity is loosely referred to as India Stack. Discussion on this India Stack can be done at a later time. I just thought I'd bring it up for your reference. Next slide, please. So seeing the success of Aadhaar, many countries sent delegations to India to understand if they could implement something similar in their respective countries. It was possible to create Aadhaar in India owing to the resources, especially in the IT space. Other countries found that there was a lack of software solution that they could take home. And this led to the birth of the MOSIP project. And MOSIP stands for Modular Open Source Identity Platform. I'm part of MOSIP currently. Next slide, please. Philanthropic organizations such as the Tata Trust, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Omidyar Network, NORAD, all of them came together in 2018 along with iSpirit, a think tank, and IIIT Bangalore, an academic institute, to build a team. We studied the good practices of ID system across the globe to define and build an ID platform, which could be adopted by any country to build its foundational digital ID system. MOSIP provides the ability to collect and process ID information, issue IDs, and perform ID verification functions, including the eKYC. MOSIP is open source, it's open standards, prevents vendor lock-in, and uses privacy by design principle. And MOSIP is free for countries to adopt. MOSIP is, next slide, please. MOSIP is currently being adopted by countries like Morocco and the Philippines for a national rollout. Ethiopia and Guinea are also pilot testing the platform, and we have other countries requests in the pipeline. Next slide. So thank you everyone for your attention. A copy of the presentation will be circulated by the organizers, and we'll be happy to take questions on Aadhaar as well as MOSIP. Over to you, Sean. Thanks. Sean, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Rod. Shri, thank you so much. We've got so many questions coming in, and we'll pick those up in the Q&A section. So we'll move now from India to Estonia. And Florian Marcus is Digital Transformation Advisor at the e-Estonia Briefing Centre and is going to share with us how Estonia has tackled this problem. And similar to India, but yet so much new learning here. Florian, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. I'll get right to the chase. The electronic ID in Estonia. First of all, it is absolutely compulsory. There's effectively no single person in Estonia that does not have an electronic ID, which is usually the 11-digit number, very similar to the Aadhaar system, but it's been around for a bit longer. And so everybody has this number, and this means that all the different government authorities use that number to exchange and store data about me. So this means that the electronic ID in Estonia, for example, the electronic ID card with the chip card on the back, is not just my ID card. It is also my driver's license. It is also in the UK, the NHS card. It would also be, because it can be used by the private sector, it could also be my loyalty card for the bookstore or anything else, your loyalty card for the supermarket. This is the foundation of many, many things in Estonia. And as I said, it is compulsory. I did say, for example, the electronic ID card. There are also other electronic ID carriers. Sarah said at the start that mobile is expected to be king, and I couldn't agree more, because in Estonia for a few years, we've had this app called Smart ID, which is also two-factor authentication. So we can be pretty certain who's behind the phone, who's trying to use the services. This brings me to my next point. We have to be very clear that electronic IDs themselves don't do anything for the underbanked or people who miss services in any way. ID is an enabler for better services to service the entire population. And when we talk about the topic of financial inclusion, I guess there are several points that we can look at, not just whether it's easier for banks to do background checks, but also other things. To give you an example, in Estonia, everybody has an electronic ID and all the services are online. 99% of government services are. So that means that you can log in with your electronic ID and you can create a company within 20 minutes online. You don't need a tax advisor. You don't need some sort of notary to confirm all of this. You can get started today. Meaning, if you are being laid off because of COVID or something happened to you, you wanna start up your own business, you can do that today, right now. Another thing that I want to talk about is what we call proactive government services. To give you an example, child benefits in most countries you would have to apply for once the child is born. You would have to get, of course, the birth certificate. You would have to go to the respective government authorities. In Estonia, when a baby is born, the baby gets a personal code, an electronic ID. It would be connected to those electronic IDs of the parents, the legal guardians. And then automatically you would have the service triggered so that the parents get a notification in the state portal that says, congratulations on the birth of your child, to which bank account do we send the money? So this is how we try to include these people even more, because especially those that are underserved by banks, those that are perhaps less well educated or socially well off, those are the ones that don't know every single law and what kinds of benefits and support systems they're actually entitled to. That's why in many countries around the world, I'm sure also in the UK, many of those support systems, they're not actually used that as much as they were expected to be used, because people don't know about them. So these proactive services can help quite a bit. There is a third thing that e-residency can help with, and I'm going to share my screen for just a second. Namely something called e-residency. E-residency means that anyone around the world, including you guys, who's never set foot on Estonian soil, can also get an electronic ID, and you can use it to create a company in Estonia and run it online. You might do that, for example, if you're German, you might do it because bureaucracy is terrifying in Germany, I can attest to that, and you just want to run a hassle-free online business. For Brits, it might be quite interesting because you're no longer part of the EU, and having a company within the European single market might be quite interesting, which is why the Brits actually, you've got almost 4,000 EU residents registered in Estonia, and you've created over 600 companies that at least partially pay taxes in Estonia rather than in the UK. So this is what electronic ID can do for not just for our own population, but also for people outside those borders. Now, many people ask, well, What about privacy? What about data protection? And in Estonia, the answer is very simple. We have something called a data tracker, where I can see every single time which government authority looked at what part of your data, when, and most importantly, for what reason. So we have to be very clear. Digitalization is a tool that can be used to create a big brother state, but it can also be a tool to make matters much more transparent than they've ever been before. And last but not least, I'm of course reading your questions. I'm looking forward to the Q&A as well. But if you go on e-Estonia.com and you click on About Us, you will also find my email address here. You can add me on LinkedIn, and we can talk later also. So yeah, that's all from my side for now. I'm looking forward to having a nice chat afterwards. Thanks.
Florian, thank you so much. Again, loads of questions coming in. You picked up there on the security, the safeguards. People are interested in the impact on tax, around what stops people feeling confident with the digital ID. So many things to pick up in the discussion, really exciting. So we're going to pass now to Radhika Kale. And Radhika has a background in leading global transformation programs. Right now, she's leading work around digital ID at HSBC. And one of the reasons that we've asked Radhika to speak is because we're really interested in the way that HSBC is thinking around the use of a bank's data. And we know that often banks think about data as something to, to mine and to kind of think about business development. But Radhika is going to share a different approach to thinking about banks' data. So Radhika, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. So Rod, if we could have the slide on, please. Thank you. So I'll be covering basically how can banks use digital ID to improve our processes, and how can an organized identity platform help with inclusion. Globally, through the advancements in technology, we are seeking to simplify processes for our customers, while at the same time improving our management of financial crime. The conversations include customer pain points, security, privacy, and customer consent. The regulation, policies, processes that are put in place to prevent financial crime can cause issues around financial inclusion. Meanwhile, financial crime continues to be a growing problem. We think at HSBC, digital ID, and more specifically, an organized identity platform, can support both better management of financial crime and better financial inclusion. For us at HSBC, the digital ID strategy is based on the premise that banks would like secure digital access to a wide range of customer data attributes from reputable sources predicated on customer consent. This needs to include on-demand digital access to government health sources. Access to a wide range of sources, around customer data attributes will take away the need for customers to be physically present and provide the opportunity to expand beyond traditional requirements such as passport or utility bill for identity verification, and therefore increasing the possibility around financial inclusion. If we could move on to the next slide, please, Rod. So as you can see, there are a number of digital ID solutions live across the globe, from identity providers to the schemes that Shri and Florian talked about, direct source, ID scan and biometrics, an ID vault, wallet, or an organized identity platform. So where these solutions exist, banks do take advantage of them, primary example being India with Aadhaar. But what an organized identity platform like the one live in Canada and just launched in the US can both use the best of what is already available, but also provide a safe, secure, private platform which can encourage new sources of data to be made available. This type of solution, which connects data providers to data consumers, predicated on customer consent, is HSBC's preference. The reason why an organized identity platform can lead to improved financial inclusion is that the number of data providers is potentially infinite. It matters only that they are reputable and not just trusted. What we mean, or how we define reputable, is an organization that relies on customer data. Example, the database of a utility company may not be perfect, but it's considered as a reputable source. within that, unlimited range of data providers can be the sources of data that support financial inclusion. For example, Department of Work and Pensions, or UK tax authority like the HMRC. An organized identity platform does not restrict itself, like I said before, to the traditional sources such as passport or utility bill. But what it needs is, of course, digital access, so access to a PC or a smartphone. Rod, if we could move on to the next slide, please. So this is what the solution in Canada looks like. This is live in Canada and in fact is also used to access government services. So how does the customer gain access to the platform? So at the outset, the customer will use their bank logon, but then the question remains, what if a citizen is unbanked and does not have a bank account? In that case, it could also be tailored to a government logon. More likely, the logon can be created using data from the government source, such as Department of Work and Pensions or UK's tax authority being the HMRC, depending on which parties have signed up to the service. Sorry, Rod, thank you. And this could also, so the citizen can then further be verified by accessing a range of data available on the solution. As an example use case, if I was to open a new bank account as a banked customer, I can access the platform using my existing banking credentials and then consent to the data required by the new bank to open the account. For an unbanked customer, in this instance, they could access the platform using alternate means, such as their previously created logon using the DWP or UK HMRC services, and then consent to sharing the required data attributes from the relevant sources. In both cases, the customer will consent per transaction, per piece of data. The solution is triple blind because it's just a data exchange platform. The information is just passing through. There is no honeypot being created. Now, the solution in Canada, as it is owned by the banks who take care of the governance and the quality of the login. For this, of course, to be successful, you need a number of reputable players within the ecosystem, both as data providers and data consumers. Often, an organization will play both roles. What is critical is access to government-held data, both from a financial inclusion and improved management of financial crime. In summary, the key to unlocking this is not the tech. We know that exists. It is government giving access to citizen data so that banks can access those wider sources of information and improve inclusion and management of financial crime. I do realize there was a lot of information packed there in the 5 or 6 minutes that I had. So I'd be happy to answer any questions as part of the Q&A. Thank you.
Oh, Radhika, that was amazing. Thank you so much. You covered so many questions around models and the different ways that models interact. Thank you. And we'll pick up some of the questions that are coming through in the Q&A. So mobile matters, but it matters in a range of different ways and it matters differently in different places. And I'm going to hand now to Yiannis Theodorou, who is, I think now, having spoken to him about this, an expert in the role of mobile. And Yiannis works in a really fascinating role. He's a senior director within the GSMA Mobile for Development Group and is thinking about digital ID and how can digital ID really increase access to so many different kinds of services. Yiannis, over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sean, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll just skip to the next slide, Rod, given that Sean introduced me. But yeah, just for everyone's sort of benefit, to put things into context. So the mission of our program has been to explore and advocate for the various roles that mobile can play as an enabler of digital ID and help specifically underserved groups access services that are both socially impactful and also commercially sustainable in developing markets. And our program is supported by the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the GSMA and its members. Next slide, please. So a key trend that was evident over the last year has been the impact of COVID on accelerating countries' digital transformation. with mobile acting as a gateway for people to accessing life-enhancing services from the comfort of their own homes while in lockdown. So beyond communication with loved ones, clearly mobile has enabled health, education, e-government, and of course, access to financial services. But many of these services depend on people being able to digitally verify their ID online. And that's why having an inclusive digital ID ecosystem and the infrastructure in place to verify people's digital IDs remotely is crucial, especially for vulnerable groups who never had the opportunity to access such services digitally before. Next slide, please. Please. So, as I'm sure many of you sort of use mobile banking services that you signed up to using your smartphone, having verified your ID with your bank. But in much of the developing world, millions of people are unable to access traditional bricks and mortar banks, and are financially included through basic mobile money wallets offered by subsidiary companies of their mobile operator. Of course, such mobile money providers are also licensed by the central banks and have to comply with customer due diligence and ID verification requirements as part of anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism objectives. Next slide, please. So the consequence of having stringent KYC requirements is that many people who are unable to prove who they are and cannot therefore access any mobile SIM cards or more financial service in their own name are unbanked. The World Bank actually estimates that 1 billion people lack an official form of identification. So we conducted research, which hasn't yet been published, will be published in April, among several low and middle income countries. And the early insights, as you can see on this slide, show that women and those attending primary education only are significantly less likely to have a SIM card registered in their own name. Other vulnerable groups include persons with disabilities, the unemployed, and rural populations. So these socioeconomic predictors may well be applicable to the UK, and I think Sarah at the beginning covered this a bit. Next slide, please. Okay, so why are some underserved groups, including women, unable or unwilling to get an ID or a digital ID to access digital services? So based on our research, these 6 factors topped the list. Firstly, many don't see the value of having one, as they don't really know how it could benefit them. Then geographical barriers or cultural norms, especially among some more patriarchal societies or religions, prevent women from accessing digital IDs or services in their own names. Then we've got end user challenges where the digital ID journey hasn't really been robust enough, leading to fraud and concerns. We also have low digital skills and literacy. And last but not least, privacy concerns and lack of trust around government or malicious actors potentially accessing the data and sort of fear of that happening. Next slide, please. So this brings me to the various roles that mobile operators are playing or could play in strengthening digital ID ecosystems. So if we start from the left to the right of this slide, mobile operators have a nationwide presence, experience in dealing with customers and managing their data and privacy. So they're well placed to act as government enrollment partners in signing up people to any new digital ID platform. And I think Radhika alluded to that earlier. In fact, we're seeing several public-private partnerships being formed around the world where MNOs are playing a role in this space. As we move towards the right side of this diagram, we see that MNOs can also play a role in digital ID verification and authentication of a mobile user remotely, not least because they can combine several attributes about the user's experience, including the location, mobile number, their registration data, and so on, to offer a level of assurance that an individual holding the phone is indeed the person trying to access a service or a benefit, for example. Next slide, please. And we have done more research in 31 countries, and we found that MNOs are either offering or keen to offer identity verification services, with financial services, insurance, and social cash transfers being the top 3 use cases of interest. Next slide, please. So by way of an example, in Zambia, we are supporting a live project where mobile operators have partnered with a social protection agency to verify beneficiaries via their mobile subscription records, and enabling the cash disbursement to take place digitally via mobile money channels, with increased confidence that funds are sent to the intended beneficiary. Next slide, please. And a different project in Nigeria that we're supporting involves a mobile operator helping small business owners leveraging their mobile money transactional history to access microloans by assigning a digital ID-based credit score to the business owner whose name the SIM card and mobile money wallet are registered in. So this allows the small business owner to demonstrate their credibility as a business and access credit from lenders. Next slide, please. So to finish off, these are a few of the policy recommendations that we concluded on based on our extensive work in developing countries. I'll just call out a few that may be more relevant to the UK. Firstly, no single government department can build a digital ID ecosystem without cross-government coordination. So engagement with other relevant departments, including the financial and telecoms regulatory authorities at the minimum, is crucial. Widely and meaningfully consulting with the private sector is also a must. Building the infrastructure to allow the real-time validation of digital ID by the private sector is also important, whether it's smart card-based or mobile-based or biometric-based. The ability of an entity to query the person's digital ID credential and contribute to the strengthening of the ecosystem is crucial. And of course, promoting digital literacy among underserved groups and helping develop appropriate and trustworthy digital services that will drive demand and adoption is also key for a digital ID ecosystem to thrive. So I think I'll stop there and address any questions later on. So thank you very much.
Yiannis, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Really interesting insight. And of course, in the UK, we don't have the requirement to provide an identity document when having, for example, a pay-as-you-go mobile. But when kind of, Yiannis talks through the way that mobile works in those different models, I think there's so much that we can think about there in terms of broadening access. Our final panelist is Emrys, and Emrys Schoemaker is a researcher and a strategist. We began with a researcher, Sarah, bringing fresh new research, and I've asked Emrys to listen to the conversation and to hear what people are saying, to bring your own amazing experience, Emrys, from the range of work that you do, currently based in Amman, so joining us from Jordan, but you've worked in the UK, you've worked in an international setting across different continents, and having that both expert and broad perspective. You've been listening to what people have been saying. You're on one of the working groups for the UK government's attempts to think about digital ID right now. You've got insight from around the world. I want to hand over to you and just say, so what do we do? How do we proceed? What are the challenges? What have you been hearing today that's made you think this is really interesting and kind of calls to action? Take your pick. Over to you.
Wow, there's a menu of options. Thank you, Sian, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this really interesting discussion. It's great to be part of a discussion that's particularly looking at drawing on international experiences and exploring what they mean for the UK. I think so often in the international development context, we do the opposite. We look at everything we've done in developed, so to speak, countries and think about how we can apply them in underdeveloped. I think it's really interesting to look at doing that in reverse, and there certainly is an awful lot to learn. I thought I might just share a few thoughts on what I took away from some of the previous presentations, and then a few learnings from our experience, both some of the concepts we found helpful, some of the opportunities that we've seen, and some of the challenges and what they might mean for the UK. Firstly, with Shrikant's description of Aadhaar, I mean, it's always interesting to hear descriptions of Aadhaar. It has become the canonical example of ID systems in development. And it was interesting to hear this, definition of a problem, financial exclusion, and the role of Aadhaar in enabling financial inclusion, addressing exclusion, and this very technical solution to it. And I think the critical features for me of Aadhaar that are worth recognizing is that it's a state-led, centrally controlled system, which has been successful because the government has been able to force it through. And as Florian was saying, it was introduced as a voluntary system, but is now essentially mandatory. If you want to access almost any service, including opening a bank account or access welfare benefits, you have to have an Aadhaar ID. Increasingly, it's being talked about as being necessary to get COVID passports and so on as well. So clearly, it's been incredibly successful in terms of numbers of adoption. But I think it's worth flagging just at this point that there are also issues around it. There have been legal challenges brought to Aadhaar's constitutional position. Is it actually, what was it actually a constitutional innovation? As well as to some of the data protection and privacy issues and harms to vulnerable groups. No system is perfect, and there are challenges with all of them. I think it's important to understand what those challenges are in order to be able to develop innovations that can deliver. Florian's description was always interesting, again, to hear about Estonia. Again, outside of development, it is the canonical reference point. Almost universal ID, digital state. X-Road is perhaps the most exported digital platform for government. It's an incredibly striking model, and its ease of access, the integrated nature, and of course, individual visibility into data use is super interesting. But again, caveats, I think it's important to note the context. Estonia is a beautiful but small, homogenous post-Soviet country, which started with its digital infrastructure from essentially a greenfield position. Very few countries are in that position and unable to follow the same model and path. And similarly, X-Road is also a centralized platform, and I believe it has been subject to data attacks, but I don't think an actual breach or exploitation of that data, which of course is good to know, but worth acknowledging that centralized platforms has already been referenced, honeypots for attacks. Radhika talked about the important perspective of financial service providers on the importance of ID in providing services. What I find particularly important about the Canada reference model is less secure key specifically, but more the context in which secure key has been enabled, which is Canada's policy approach of a trust framework, setting the rules of the road rather than the system-specific approaches to digital identity. So the fact that Canada has allowed innovations such as secure key has seen all sorts of new and interesting services being developed, which, as Radhika outlined, is incredibly valuable. Yiannis's description of the barriers to ID, including important ones like perceived need. Why do we need an ID? Nobody signs up for an ID because they want an ID. They sign up because they have to get an ID to access the service or the benefit that they're looking for. And clearly mobile is an important one in enabling digital elements of that. I thought Yiannis's description of ID as existing within ecosystems is particularly helpful because no ID exists in isolation. And so I'm sure Florian's description of his digital ID system in Estonia is integral to the wider digital context and digital nature of Estonia as perhaps the leading digital nation. So I think these were, for me, really interesting points around the presentation so far. Very briefly, a few thoughts on some concepts, opportunities, and challenges that we've learned. One thing that we've learned is it's really important to think about what digital ID actually is, to think and to recognize that it's about being seen, it's about being recognized, and that as a credential, it's a form of proof that others can rely on that we are who we say we are. And as a result, fundamentally, it's about relationships, about the identifier, the issuer, the identified, who's receiving the credential, and relying parties who rely on those credentials to provide services. We say that tech is neither good, bad, but never neutral. and it amplifies existing power relations. So the nature of those relationships shapes the implications of digital ID, including for financial inclusion. Power is going to be, and inequality is going to be amplified through any form of digital ID unless it's explicitly designed not to do so. Opportunities that we've seen. So identity empowers where it reflects legal status, like a birth certificate, passport, driving licenses. For example, in our work with refugees, we've heard how people value having a refugee ID because it recognizes their legal status and allows access to their entitlements. Refugee IDs can also enable access to financial services, but whether this is to full financial services depends on national law, not on the design of the ID system. In many countries, refugees are not allowed to access bank accounts. And this has got nothing to do with whether the system enables it or not. So importantly, regulation is absolutely critical. Bodies like the Financial Action Task Force define the KYC and AML requirements that are established, and that define for many people whether they're included or excluded from accessing ID systems. So we might want to ask whether current legislation in the UK is fit for purpose to address financial inclusion challenges. And I think this is where the UK's trust framework is a step in the right direction, even if the recent announcements of a centrally issued ID may raise more eyebrows and concerns. The other aspect that we've seen, I think, that's a real value is digital ID can enable people to bypass exploitative credit provision. For example, in Kenya, those without ID or credit ratings have been forced to turn to exploitative credit providers and usurious rates of interest, leading to people being recycling loans, taking out loans to service other loans. This is clearly hugely problematic. So I think we know that this is a problem in the UK. Payday loans are a big issue. And so ID may provide access to forms of credit that are more beneficial. I'm going to run very briefly through some of the challenges. I'm aware I'm very close to time. So identification systems, I believe, are enabling and also constraining by their very nature. So they can be problematic and they can further exclusion. Aadhaar, that Radhika talked about, was introduced that Shrikant talked about. It was introduced, as I said, as a voluntary service and simply as a recognition of residency and no legal status. But it's now mandatory to access nearly all services in India, including bank accounts. Yet some people in India have been prevented from accessing Aadhaar accounts. In Northeast India, people in Aadhaar, the people in Assam were prevented from accessing Aadhaar because there was a fear that those with contested citizenship, people who've been moving across the border with Bangladesh and India, would use Aadhaar to access services intended only for citizenships or even as a pathway to citizenship. And as a result, because they've not been able to access and been prevented from accessing Aadhaar accounts, they're not able to access welfare services or any of the other services that they're entitled to. This is an illustration of any ID system. They can be used to exclude as well as to include. So we need to acknowledge that in enabling recognition, digital ID introduces new opportunities for surveillance and control. And as a technology, the digital aspect of ID mediates those relationships between identifier, identified, and reliant parties. And here the nature of the technology matters. We've already heard some references to biometrics, for example. And these are increasingly relied on in emerging economies and humanitarian sectors because they're easy ways to determine uniqueness. But a fingerprint or an iris scan is, while it's easy to establish uniqueness, for some people it's very difficult to actually provide those credentials. So for example, we know in India, manual laborers whose fingerprints may be eroded struggle to register for Aadhaar. Or in cultures where physical contact, the use of biometric registration points often involve physical contact in order for the reader to actually function. And that can be very problematic for people, particularly women in some contexts. So finally, another problematic with biometrics, as one World Food Programme person that I interviewed put it, biometrics are the ideal tool for persecution. You know exactly who you're dealing with, you can target them, and you can exclude, or worse, in the most horrific ways. It's striking, I think, in this context that here in the UK, we've already rejected once plans for a digital ID. So there's very real reasons and concerns for not having IDs. And I think we need to acknowledge that while they are critical and are going to be central pieces of architecture, digital architecture in our digital future, They are contested, they're problematic, and we need to understand the very specific ways they exclude particular populations as much as we recognize their potential for inclusion. 4 points for ways forward. And I think here, research into vulnerable groups particularly, it's great to see the OAX research that Sarah described earlier. But I think further analysis to understand exactly who's vulnerable and why. Sarah's description was really interesting as a description of who is excluded or included, but very little to explain why. And I think we need a deeper dive into some of people's experiences to understand that. Secondly, we really all need to understand who wishes to remain financially excluded. Not everybody wants a bank account. Not everybody wants to be identified. And we need to understand that and respect that. We need to provide non-digital alternatives for people who choose not to. Thirdly, I think all ID systems exist in a political context, and it's absolutely critical to map out the ecosystem of ID systems in their legal, social, regulatory, political context to understand who may fall through the cracks, what risks may be amplified, and who can be further protected and included. Finally, I think sandbox innovation is critical. We shouldn't be testing these incredibly powerful technologies on vulnerable groups, but we should be adopting the approach that the Bank of England has shown can work very well by developing things like financial sandboxes. I'd like to see identification sandboxes where innovation can be explored, piloted, and tested before it's rolled out for people who may be whose lives may be transformed by these new digital technologies. I'll end there, and apologies if that came across as too critical or too negative. Absolutely not. These systems have a huge potential. We need to understand the risks so we can maximize the benefits that they offer.
Emrys, thank you. Absolutely. You know, there are questions coming in throughout the session and in every conversation any of us have about digital ID around the risks and the mitigating factors that we need to put in place. So thank you for bringing them out. So we've got probably about realistically 5 or 6 minutes to pick up on some questions. And I promise that every question you've put into the chat or into the Q&A, we will come back to you in various forms. So if your question doesn't get answered right now, don't worry, we'll pick up with it later. So one question is around blockchain. Where does blockchain fit into this? And Florian, let me come to you. I know you've got views on where blockchain fits in.
Yeah, very quickly, of course, blockchain as part of data ownership is an interesting idea. So how can we make sure that citizens or residents are, capable of controlling their own data? The only real answer to that would be to have, I don't want to get too far into the technicalities, but a public ledger blockchain. The issue with that is that most governments will be extremely resistant to that idea. They will want to have a permission blockchain where they have 1 or 2 or 3 or a dozen trust providers and trust services that would run that blockchain. That sort of runs the idea of blockchain, ad absurdum, in my opinion. But still, there are other things that we can do to make sure that citizens are aware of the value of their data and that they can handle it more directly. In the Estonian e-healthcare system, you can see every single doctor's visit, every single time you've been to a hospital, and you can decide to individually block every single visit and what's been written down during that visit, even for your own doctor, actually. And the other thing is that in Estonia, we have, since the very beginning, we've had the once-only policy, meaning there's always only one respective authority that holds a certain data set, such as my address. And if there's any other authority that needs my address for a certain other service, I need to give them permission to do that. So there are ways of doing that without blockchain. And also bearing in mind the GDPR, you're not allowed to store personal data on the blockchain in the public sector because you have the right to be forgotten. And one of the best and worst things of the blockchain is that it does not forget.
Brilliant, thank you. Can we carry on with the data ownership piece? Radhika, can I come to you? So data ownership, a country like the UK and many others, people are very skeptical about anyone telling us that we have to be labeled in a certain way or that data has to be stored about us in a certain way. So I think the kind of solution that you're proposing in your view, really kind of help solve that problem? Can you tell me more?
So the Canada solution, based on the organized identity platform, what it does is customers consenting to every piece of information shared, and each transaction is being consented by the customer. So if I ask for if I'm opening a bank account and it is my address proof that's needed, I have to consent for that piece of information at that point in time. So at no point does the system record that information. It's just an exchange platform. So it's passing through. There is no honeypot being created. So in summary, the customer is owning their data and is allowing at each point as to when, depending on the use case, when they want to share their data, and giving the permission that and it's customer is king when it comes to their data in this case.
Brilliant, thank you. And I just want to pick up, I think we've got time for one more question around, I think I'll frame it as people who have to move, people who have had to move, people who might have to move. Migration is going to be an increasingly big challenge for all countries of the world, not just because of the issues we've seen around economic migration, but we're going to have environmental migration in the future. So migration, matters to all countries now. And I wonder whether, Yiannis, I might come to you, and forgive me for putting you on the spot, thinking about the work that you've seen and how mobile helps people be included. What are the kind of key thoughts you've got around migration, people who maybe are fleeing, so refugees? How can we help with a digital ID? What difference does it make? What do we need to think about?
You're touching on a huge question there, and I'm sure Emrys can chip in as well. But on displaced persons and refugees, the main challenge there is the fact that they are fleeing a country and then landing somewhere else. The new host country has their own laws and regulations about who and how individuals can access services, including mobile services. So, and a key challenge we've seen around the world, working with UNHCR and others, is that many host countries fail to cater for what these displaced people have or don't have as ID documents, and sometimes by omission they exclude them from being able to access services in that host country. So number one rule is, if you are a government thinking about your policies around inclusion, and you are hosting refugees and displaced people, then make sure you cater for those identity documents or credentials that they have as they come into your country. In terms of you had a point around general migration, environmental, and so on. That's a big issue around the mutual recognition and how one country can recognize another country's digital ID credentials, so that if I'm a citizen of country A and I go to country B, which is what's happening in Europe with EIDAS, for those who are close to that, country B would allow me to use my country A digital ID to access the equivalent of the NHS or the credit tax sort of profile and so on. So there's a lot of work going on around the world at the regional level, I would say, in Europe, in Africa, and so on, around this mutual recognition of each other's digital ID systems. But yeah, I barely scratched the surface, but I think the questions are quite big to address in 1 minute.
Yeah, I know. That's why I said forgive me. We are running out of time, and this is a conversation that could really run. So thank you to all of you. You've been amazing. Thank you to everyone who's been listening. We've got a couple of asks, so we would love to get your feedback. It's the first time we've run an event like this, which is kind of drawing, as Emrys said, kind of turning the lens the other way around and trying to think about what the international learning. Amazing panel, can we have a part 2, asks Jenny, and I think yes, we can. So the first thing that we're going to ask is if you can give us some feedback. We're going to do a little poll at the moment in a minute, well, hopefully now, and if you can tell us about your views of the event, that would be brilliant. We've also got a little kind of feedback form that we'll email to all participants. I never fill them in, and now I know why it's so important that people fill them in. So if I can ask for you to fill them in, that would be amazing, because we'd really like to know, are we on the right track? Are we using your time well? Are we covering the topics that you care about? And the other thing to say is just a huge thank you to our sponsors. Rod, if you could launch the slides for me. I can't see anything. I don't know if that's just my bad tech.
I haven't launched it yet.
Oh yeah, that would be great. Thank you. So we've had some amazing support for this event, as well as this incredible group of people here sharing their expertise. And again, thank you for that. We've also had some fantastic support from a range of people. So the University of Nottingham, Learning Without Borders, are running something called the Social Impact Game, and so much of the work behind the scenes has been run by a group of students who are learning about great project management. And the team there, they've put together the Zoom package for us, the polls, worked on all of the impact assessments. So thank you very much. Rod, if you can move the next slide, please. And the kind of, if you can use this QR code and fill in our poll, that would be amazing. Thank you so much. The other thing to say is that we are running other events in the future, and we would love to know, what do you want to learn about? And so these are some of the events that we're going to be running. If they're not going to tick your box, if they're not going to kind of get you interested, what would? How can the Financial Inclusion Forum share international learning around microfinance and financial inclusion in a way that meets your needs and interests? Please, please, please let us know. And I think finally to say that there's a whole range of ways that we would welcome support. We're all volunteers, and even in a virtual event, it kind of costs time, energy, and sadly money to run this kind of stuff. So if you'd like to be a supporter in some way, then we would love to hear from you. And if you have knowledge to share, get in touch with us. If you have contacts or networks you can link us into, that would be amazing. If you're a corporate or an organization who'd be interested in sponsoring an event, then that would be fantastic. And a final word of thanks to our kind of key sponsors who keep us going, to Citi, to CDC, to EY, and to Vision Fund. So thank you so much. It's been incredible. To the speakers, thank you. Rod, thank you for saving me when my IT crashed. And we will be following up soon. And a last question, can we just skip back to the QR code, please, Rod, because people are saying they want to fill it in, but they can't access it. That would be amazing. It's 15:31. I'm trying to finish on time. We'll hang around for anyone who's still here, but otherwise, thank you so much. Have a lovely day.